Hello and welcome to today's Global Fleet Champions webinar. In case you haven't joined us before, Global Fleet Champions is a partnership campaign administered by Brake, the road safety charity, to prevent deaths, injuries and pollution caused by vehicles driven for work. To learn more about the campaign and what we do, visit globalfleetchampions.org. During today's webinar, we're going to discuss one of the most requested topics from last year's events, defensive driving. I'm pleased to say that we're joined by Andrew Drewary from Road Safety Smart and have a pre-recorded presentation by Iain Westmore from Red Driver Training. We're going to cover today what defensive driving is and how it can protect drivers, the benefits of defensive driving for your organisation, and how to implement defensive driver training in your fleet. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and the full recording will be made available on the Global Fleet Champions website over the next few days. We will also in the future be producing a fact sheet that will be published as a resource on the website as well. In a few moments, you should be able to see a word cloud poll question appear on your screen. It will be anonymous. You simply enter your answers into the box and we will discuss the results at the beginning of the Q&A session. This will be your opportunity to put questions to today's panelists, and you can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the chat function on Teams. The poll question should now be appearing on your screen. You can fill in answers using the submit an answer box. I will give you a minute to answer this question and the webinar will then begin. Thank you. Okay, I can see most of you have now completed the poll. I'll close this now and we'll discuss the results at the end of the webinar. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker for today, Andrew Drewary from Road Safety Smart, who will be delivering an overview of what is defensive driving.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this session this afternoon on what is defensive driving, brought to you by Global Fleet Champions. I'm a proud supporter of Global Fleet Champions and have been on their committee since its inception. So I think this session today is a vitally important session, given the changes to the highway code that have just come in. And I'm going to bring a few scenarios and a bit of expertise and experiences from my own background as a collision investigator. Have been for the last 21 years, dealt with over 40,000 collisions in that time. Yes, I haven't investigated them all. I've had a team that's helped me with that, but the analysis of those investigations, and probably more so what I've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years in respect of road safety, will come out in this sort of little taster session that I'm putting to you now. And I think it's one of those things that we hear the word and we hear the description, what is defensive driving, or you need to go on a defensive driving course, but what does it actually entail? And what we're trying to do and make the roads better when we send our staff on these courses. And I think really is understanding not just what your employees need to do when they're out and about representing your company and organisations, but also defensive driving is a culture that's bred into the drivers from the organisation itself. So what policies and processes do you have in place to encourage your staff to carry out this defensive driving scenario to make themselves safer? So defensive driving is anticipating and spotting major risks and potential hazards before they occur. Sounds simple, goes back to what we were taught when we were all taught to drive, to expect the unexpected at all times. But as driving becomes very common to us and very familiar, we just take it for granted and get in the car and don't really think about it. So we're sort of going back to basics here with the driving scenario. So driving in a way that keeps you safe. And when we say you, that could be your employee on the road for you at this moment in time, but also you as an organisation and your brand. So goes back to what we said at the introduction, instill that safety culture from the board level all the way through to your employees driving on the road for you. It's also about keeping their passengers safe, your passengers safe, anybody in the vehicle that is on the road for company business. And as important as ever, everybody else that is on the road to make sure all the road users are safe and secure at all times. And I think when we go on to the next slide, you'll see a number of topics and a number of bullet points that I've raised in the 10 that are on the slide that are all evidence-based from the collision investigations that I've done over the years. And to be fair, they are probably as prevalent now as they've ever been because of the changes to the highway code and the hierarchy of road users to show that we're doing as much as possible to keep ourselves safe and other road users safe. But the bigger the vehicle, the more damage that vehicle can cause, then the drivers and the organisations need to show that they're doing as much as possible to make sure every journey and every vehicle is safe on the road at all times. So the things that we're going to just quickly go through seem very, very straightforward. But it's amazing how many drivers driving privately, could be you going to and from work on your commute, or people working for you. These are the 10 things that keep coming up time and time again that people are not doing on the road when they're driving. So let's look at it. Keep safe. So a defensive driver keeps their distance to manage the space around their vehicle. Yes, we've all been told now, 1.5 metres passing distance between parked vehicles, cyclists, pedestrians, horses, horse and cart on the road. Keep our distance. Let's manage that space around us. Drives to the weather conditions and the road conditions and not the speed limit. I think very, very important given the 3 storms we had within a week, a couple of weeks ago, the amount of drivers sent out to drive when was it safe to do so? Had the organisation sent them out to drive and the driver felt they were under pressure to do it? So how do we monitor the weather warnings that are out there and what endangers our drivers and other members of the public if we send our staff out to drive, and the commute to and from work? So we also need to look at drivers. A good defensive driver is someone who looks further ahead to anticipate potential hazards and circumstances before they occur. Preempting, as it comes down to the 4 and 5. Keep looking all around. It's not just the mirrors that are in the vehicles and on the vehicles. It's not necessarily the technology that's on the vehicles. We've got the sensors, parking sensors, we've got dash cams, we've got CCTV, all sorts of things on the vehicle now. But it's what we see with our eyes that makes us a good defensive driver. Always expect the unexpected. This is where speed comes into it, driving to the weather conditions and the road conditions, and we just need to anticipate what is happening in front of us. Keep our focus and stay alert and aware. Have we taken a driving break necessarily? Have we planned our routes properly before sending our drivers out onto the road? Do we know where we can take a break en route if something unexpected happens, or we need to stop urgently? So keep alert and focused on what we're doing and the amount of time we are driving at any given time. Research the routes, as we said, and the traffic laws. Do your staff and you organising your staff out on the road know the traffic laws? We'd probably say yes, but do we know the highway code? Possibly yes. When was the last time you actually read the highway code? Given the amount of changes and the severity and the impact these recent changes have made to everybody's thinking, do we understand how they fit in with the traffic laws? Do you and your drivers understand that they need to change the way that they're driving at this moment in time to reduce the effect and abide by the laws? So a good idea for a good defensive driver, ask staff to undertake a mock theory test every 12 months. See whether they get 43 out of 50 and make it part of your policy. But we're also there to make sure other drivers notice ourselves as a good defensive driver. Not just by being up the backside and tailgating somebody in front. It's good use of vehicle lights, good use of indicators, long signals before we do something, giving people plenty of time to know that we're there and we're going to be doing something different. Deals positively with aggressive drivers. Road rage, not probably as prevalent in the news as it was a number of years ago, but I think as more and more people are coming onto the road, and again, I'll come back to the changes to the highway code. I think the changes, if people aren't prepared and driving in a correct way, they may see more aggressive reactions to the way people drive on the road. And so you, as a driver, your employee, need to keep their emotions under control, regardless of what is being said at the time. And I think more important, probably most importantly, right at the end, if we do 1 to 9 all the time, let's make sure we have number 10 in place as well. Let's drive a safe and roadworthy vehicle at all times. Make sure staff are undertaking a vehicle check every day, where possible, but at least weekly. Make sure it's documented and it's evidence-based that there are any faults there, so you can keep a record of what is going on. No point being a great driver if the vehicle is going to break down and cause a collision on the road when we're out and about on a journey. So defensive driving is important because it allows us to keep ourselves safe. You, your employees, your brand, your operation, to keep yourself safe of any unexpected issues that may arise from somebody driving badly and not defensively during the course of their employment. Make sure everybody else is safe on the road and increases the chances for us all to return home safely every day. But I think really from an organisation perspective and an operations perspective, I think it also confirms and sends a really, really good message out about your corporate social responsibility commitment. It's driven from the top all the way down, out into the community, out into where everybody can see how your drivers drive on a daily basis and the respect they have for themselves, the organisation and everybody else on the road. So 6 things it can help avoid. Don't really need to go into these in great detail, but obviously unnecessary crashes, unnecessary deaths on the road, because if we're driving more defensively and we're learning from the investigations and the mistakes that have caused collisions in the past, it'll stop unnecessary incidents happening in the future because we should be learning from our mistakes. So yes, it will reduce and avoid unnecessary heartache, unnecessary injuries. I think from a corporate and operation perspective, it is then the unnecessary insurance claims and unnecessary prosecutions, which could be your driver or you as a line manager within the organisation. Because if you've not got your policies in place and they're not being managed properly, then the line managers are more likely to be prosecuted before any directors are in this day and age under gross negligence manslaughter. So we have the policies, make sure we've got them in place to make sure we're keeping our defensive driving up to date and in place and improving all the time. And then finally, just on the benefits, we will have reduced number of crashes and fatalities. We will have safer roads for everybody. We'll also have an improved environment. The slower we drive, the less fuel we use, and particularly in this day and age, from a cost perspective, that is great. There's been research recently, drive within the speed limit at all times and try and reduce the amount of time you stop can save up to 25% on your fuel bill. So that's a massive impact on the environment if we're saving 25% of fuel. So again, it's not just about the act of driving and people being safe on the roads, it's people's health as well. Safer employees driving for work is a big bonus at the end of the day, which improves business security because there's less likelihood of prosecutions and potentially companies being closed down because of the prosecutions. Is the last one really relevant for this session? I think so. From an organisational perspective, if we drive better and the business is more secure, that means greater profits for the business, but means greater security for everybody else around within the organisation who work for you. But also, you could plough some of that money back into the local community to help keep the roads safe wherever you are. So I know this is just a short, sharp session this afternoon for everybody. I hope what we've gone through in a little bit of detail is fine. There will be lots more information available if you contact Global Fleet Champions, and I'm sure the team there will share this session afterwards and anything else they can do to help you improve your defensive driving within your organisation. So all that's left for me is to say thank you, and if there's any questions, please put them forward and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Thank you. Goodbye.
Hi, I'm Iain Westmore from Red Driver Risk Management, and today we're going to have a chat about defensive driving. This is a little bit of a passion of mine. I'm involved in the fleet industry. I'm a training manager for Red Driver Risk Management, and so we deal with this at the coalface day to day. So without further ado, we'll go into sort of what our vision is really and the way we approach this. So what is defensive driving? Well, defensive driving is quite simple, really. We're just trying to avoid collisions. That's our key aim. Again, it's a passion of mine that's been driven from road safety from early in my driving career. I had an incident, which is most unfortunate, but now I have the tools to understand why that happened and how we can prevent it. And we hear stories every day from drivers that are out in the field as to what's happened to them. And we try and proactively avoid that. It could also mean that we are aiming to complete our journey safely and efficiently. Shouldn't all journeys be like that? That will be the dream. And then obviously a positive attitude towards all road users. We share the road. I quite enjoy sharing the road with others. But again, that's more about attitude towards other road users. So I've divided this into 3 areas, if you like, as well. So first one's driving technique. You could say driving behaviour. But the things that we tend to focus on are prediction skills, commonly known as anticipation. Some of the best drivers that I've seen will tell me what's going to happen before it happens. Being obvious and predictable is all about the being conspicuous, being seen, you know, whether that's our headlights being on, whether that's the use of the horn proactively in the proper way, and also being predictable as well. Is it clear what I'm going to be doing next? And then creating space and escape routes, which is a real passion of mine. And I don't think we go far enough within the road safety realm. I'm trying to push that. The other thing will be basic knowledge. I think it's pretty scary that I don't think all drivers have a good knowledge, not only of the basics, but also of things like the common collisions. Surely, if they're common, we can try and avoid them if we know what they are, or the common mistakes that we make. And the other bit is that this makes no effort to change anything unless we have motivation to change it. What is that driver's motivation or our motivation to change it? So we like to create carrots and sticks. So an example of this is some of our clients, they do have sanctions in place to if a driver does something that they shouldn't do, there are sanctions in place. So it could be a disciplinary, quite serious disciplinary action and investigation into the situation. For example, speeding might be an example of that, or maybe mobile phone use. But also we've seen some interesting carrots. So some of the carrots we've seen are things like the managing director gets a D grade because their driving's deemed as not very good, but the sales guy gets an upgrade on their vehicle because they've been driving really well. But also things like driver of the year competition and driving behaviours like that. So saying, who's the best on miles to the gallon, or who has the lowest idle running, or what have you. So really driving not only from a perspective of collisions, but also from cost within business as well. And what we say is collisions can be avoided. It's just having the knowledge and the skills to be able to do that and understanding those things. So now we know what it is. We need to understand the benefits, and obviously from a business perspective, it's very much about cost, but really this should all be about safety. That should be the top of our priority list. And again, we could do carrot or stick. It's a carrot when we don't have a collision because it doesn't cost us money and it doesn't go down the reputational route. But equally, from a stick perspective, we have quite serious laws in place now where directors can be prosecuted, which does happen from time to time. And unfortunately, this tends to be quite reactive rather than proactive, and we encourage clients to be very proactive and do training and development before an incident or incidents occur. Sometimes it's quite hard to develop that relationship with the client, but they soon realise that's the way to do it. And of course, the big one from a fleet perspective is the costs. So it's a really easy sell to say for every collision that we avoid. And the big one here will be when the vehicle's off the road and they need a hire car, and the staffing costs involved with that is a really big ask. That costs a lot of money, and also time. Somebody's out of the business, somebody else has got to cover that role, and there's the stress element to that as well, on top of all other things. And obviously, if they were injured or hurt, that's a really big issue as well, and it's not what we want to do. The other thing we tend to say is that the fuel reduction alone from doing really good quality training will often pay for the training itself. So it's actually cost negative in many ways. So how's it done? How do we implement this? Well, we try and create a development toolbox for the driver. How do you know how your employees are doing? So is that telematics? Is it a driver assessment? Is it driver training? Is it finding out because you've had feedback on the driver from somewhere? But how do we do that? And that's different for every business, and we work to make things bespoke with them. There needs to be very much a business culture within the business to work out how we can, care for our drivers, care for the well-being of their drivers, but also get good communication as to, what are the targets here. We want to get maybe everyone home safe every day is a really good target. Isn't that what we all want? And to be interactive with employees. Employees will give feedback to the business. Are the vehicles suitable, or is there something really simple they could do to help make their life easier? And again, finally, there has to be a motivation from a business perspective. And as we said before, very often it's cost-based, but again, ideally safety should come first on that. We need to create this motivation. So a good way to work with business is to create that motivation within the team. The other bit to touch on here in terms of how's it done is what I call the why model, which you may have heard of, how to use it, which is, there's a long list there, you can read them yourselves, but all of a sudden is a really common thing to hear when we go out with drivers. And in fact, when we start to look into that and ask why, and we do that multiple times, we get to the bottom of that, which is, they've had a long day and they're fatigued. So managing that actually is key, and once they can do that, their anticipation skills can develop as well, because they're actually paying attention and they're developing fatigue. And of course, the common themes here, well, all of the things generally come back down to the human aspect. and we focus very much on that. So our model for this one is that a crash or a collision or some form of mistake happens when they run out of space and time. This is a classic driver training fault, if you like, or issue, which is often due to a lack of concentration. Or is it observation or anticipation? But that can't be the cause. It's not the only cause. It must come back to not managing some form of well-being or emotion. So as the driver come into the driving seat of a van, truck, car, in an emotional state, and what's their well-being? A great example of this scenario is, we're 4 times more likely to have a collision when we go through a divorce. So why is that? And I'm sure you can come up with your own conclusions. We think the way it should be done is managing fatigue and emotion, which is very much a managerial piece. It's very much a business approach, which is, managing your team well and speaking to them about these things. When they can do that, that frees them up to be able to do the classic driver training stuff of concentrating on what they should be doing and observing and anticipating. Therefore, they can create space and time, but most drivers need to be shown how to do those things better and thus hopefully arrive safe every day. That's the dream. We try and sell the dream every day, but sometimes that's very challenging. When we hone in on specific driving behaviours, we do have a little saying that we use here, which is CELTS. Concentration has to be top of the list, and so often we need to get to the bottom as to why people are not concentrating. Is it within the work context the issue? We also find that drivers tend to say the all of a sudden because they don't expect it to happen. And that's very much around the word assumption. How many times have you driven down a road? No one's pulled out that junction before, but on this occasion they have, and you've done it thousands of times, but just the one time is all it takes. So it's playing with it's our brain that confuses that a little bit. So expect it to happen. People need to be marginally more pessimistic. The other bit is we're not very good at learning from mistakes. I think that's not really necessarily built into the driving task. So possibly we could be better at learning from when we have mistakes. We see drivers that have had 1, 2, 3 rear end shunts, and then they call us and say, could you do some work with this driver? Well, that's too little too late. But unfortunately, that's generally how work comes to us. So how have they learned from that? What have they taken from it? Guess what? They approach junctions quickly and brake late. And the reason behind that is often because they felt like they're under pressure. Drivers don't tend to take responsibility for their actions. It's a really important question to ask drivers, and when they actually think about it, they don't. They're not maybe haven't thought about how much responsibility they need to take. So we always ask that question about responsibility. And then space is really misunderstood by drivers. They don't understand it, they don't understand why it's there until we show them and explain that to them. And a demo drive is particularly useful to explain that, to space it out, which I'm absolutely passionate about. And then when we talk about driving techniques, we could go into a bit more detail with that. A collision could only take place when we run out of space. No one's ever crashed into space and had a problem. So why do we run out of space? Well, we clearly haven't got enough. How much is enough? And then what do we do in terms of parking? So I'm quite passionate about making sure we have a stationary escape route. Most people drive really close when they stop, and that's okay until we need to move out of the way for an ambulance or there's a potential risk about. Or what about if there's a motorcycle filtering through? How do we deal with that? How can we move out of the way and give them a bit more room? Thinking about other road users and also keeping junctions clear as well. So how much is enough in terms of stationary space? We've just got to work that out. And the other thing is creating some form of escape options, or at least options for ourselves to be able to move around on the road, which most drivers, as we know, don't always have that option to be able to move around. But let's create some space before it becomes an issue so that we can preempt it and give ourselves options. The other bit we would also encourage is being conspicuous. So that might be headlights on, front and rear, make sure we're seen. Is it the case of using horn proactively? And then proactively create options to avoid all collisions. Why not preempt it and deal with it early if we can help it? So just wrapping up the way we approach this, first of all, we try and develop a thinking driver. So we use the acronym WeCoast, which is well-being, emotion, concentration, observation, anticipation, space and time. which is very similar to the CELTs that we talked about earlier on as well. The concentration expected to happen, learn from it, etc., etc. And then it's creating business cultures as well. So we're thinking about having a plan of action and motivation to work towards a better, driving culture within the business. For example, we have clients that set what's known as life-saving rules, and we find them really useful. They're things which set a line in the sand as to what's acceptable or not, different driving behaviours, etc. So all that's left for me to do is say thank you. I'm going to be trying available for questions as well, but thank you very much for listening. The only other thing that's left to say is that we have facilities at Donington Park, and it's a wide range of facilities specifically designed for fleet training, which means that if it's van, four-wheel drive, anything that we think is going to be useful, we can deliver that at Donington Park. And I'm quite proud of what we created there. So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I can answer some of your questions a bit later. Hi.
That concludes the presentation section of today's webinar. A huge thank you to our speakers, Andrew Drewary and Iain Westmore. I'm pleased to say that Andrew has joined us today for today's question and answer session, which will begin in a few minutes. So just a quick reminder, if you have any questions you'd like to ask to him today, you can do that doing the chat function on the Teams panel. Before we go into the Q&A session quickly, though, we will have a look at the results of today's poll, which was asking you about how you identify which drivers are in need of driver training. Hopefully, you can see this on your screen. If not, it might take a couple of more seconds more to load up. If I reopen it now, it should be appearing there. Andrew, can you see that? Can you has that appeared on your screen?
I can see it. It's quite a full small format. I'm trying to see whether I can enlarge it, but it's there. It's interesting.
Are these the sort of things we expect to be seeing? Is there anything that's standing out as a surprise to you there?
I think there's possibly a couple of things that don't surprise me, but are the sorts of things that you're making a prejudgment first. We've got young drivers and new drivers. Yes, historically they've just passed the test. They should be more aware of the defensive issues because of the way they've been taught to drive at the time. So not necessarily an immediate indication, but it's good for the employer to assess them, I would say, separately and put them through a course. So the employer is happy with that they're meeting their obligations to ensure that they believe the driver meets their minimum requirement to go out and about on the road for work purposes. Incidents, accidents. I know we hate that word, Adam. Accidents with brake. Should be collisions or crashes or incidents. I think incidents for me is probably more important than crashes or collisions, because an incident could just be a near miss. So I think it's well documented out there now, and I've been saying it for a long time from the investigations I've done over the years. We learn more from incidents than we do from the crashes and the collisions, because as Iain's just said, when that happens, have we missed the opportunity to put our drivers through a defensive driving course because of the previous incidents? So I think this is where telematics is a really good identifier if we have them in the vehicles that we're using. Obviously, there'll be a lot of people driving for work in their own car or a company car that doesn't necessarily have the telematics there, so that's readily available and accessible. So I think it's trying to encourage people to report these incidents and near misses as a benefit for the company, to see how often they're happening within their group, because there's no other way of finding out. Risk profiling. Yeah, another good one. I think for me, this is a question that's come up quite a lot. over the last couple of years for me is how to risk profile somebody. We have the psychometric testing, which is great and can be quite expensive. I think a very simple one for me would be any drivers that have not read the highway code for a certain period of time, because we know we've just gone through a lot of changes recently and quite well documented, publicised changes that people may agree with or disagree with. But I think a simple solution for risk profiling would be to get your experienced drivers who say have not read the highway code for 5 years to undertake a theory test. Get the disc from DVLA that you can use as many times as you want throughout the year, and see how many of your experienced drivers who have held a driving license for over 5 years would be able to pass a theory test. Because there'll be a lot of us out there, me included, 40 years driving this year. I've taken the test once when I started. I implemented it for a client a couple of years ago. That client has reduced their collision ratio by 50% in the 2 years they've been asking their drivers to take the theory test as part of their annual re-evaluation of their authority to drive at work. Because it's changed massively, and a lot of older, long-established drivers will not be aware of so many of the changes to that solution, to that scenario. So that is a really easy, cost-effective, because it's about £40, I think, for the DVD, for the DVD and disc from DVLA, and you can use it as many times as you like. So preempt it instead of waiting for things to happen. Take the assessment to the drivers, and if they fail the theory test, because it's 43 out of 50, say 3 times, then perhaps that's a good way to bring in a reassessment in the vehicle as well.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a few questions now from attendees. So we've got one here from, forgive me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Abdus, which is saying, which method of training do you think have you found better in your experience? Training defensive driving when achieving driver certificates, or training to current everyday drivers?
I think training to current everyday drivers. And I think it's when we've looked at the defensive driving today, we've looked a lot about how to drive the vehicle as a physical aspect. I think we also need to consider how to drive the vehicle from a knowledge perspective about, are people aware of how dangerous driving is? Are they aware of how exposed they are to being involved in a collision? Do they understand the penalties and consequences for not driving defensively if they are found to be responsible for a crash or a collision? I think once people, I've found it in a lot of training sessions I've done, people are ignorant of the penalties and consequences to their actions because they don't perceive driving to be dangerous. So a bit of background about that helps with the defensive driver training. And I think once people realise how it affects them in their pocket and in their everyday life, then, and how that impacts on other people, that is a really good way of getting people to start slowing down and driving better.
Okay, another question we've got then. This is from Steve. He says, I understand this is a big subject. Do you have any tips on I assume he says on how to control emotions? Yeah, for things like stress or road rage, it'd be a big deal on a road.
It's funny. I did a session with some drivers yesterday before they went out for a new client on what to expect if they're involved in a collision, and me being involved to interview them instead of somebody internally. I think it's when something happens, we have that adrenaline rush, whether it's somebody cutting us up and we brake sharply and we have a near miss, but it shakes us up. I think it's the same with aquaplaning. Anybody who's gone through an aquaplaning event, the adrenaline rush is so severe. I think you have to learn to just take that big deep breath and just calm down, stop as soon as you can if something like that happens, but get people to realise that it's not a bad thing just to take a step back when something happens. Even if you're involved in a collision or whatever, somebody else is maybe annoying you on the road, just learn to take that deep breath. Forget about the other person in particular at that time. Concentrate on what you're doing yourself, I think, is the most important thing. If you concentrate on yourself first and you do everything as much as you can to keep control of your own emotions, then other drivers do not affect your ability and safety on the road as much at that time.
Okay, I'm just going through other questions here now that we've got. John has asked, he sees a number of collisions are not a skill set, but a mindset. For instance, not completing a circle of inspection prior to leaving from a parked area. How do we motivate drivers to do the basics before even getting behind the wheel?
I think that is a really good question, and probably ties in, because I've been looking at the questions coming through as well, to sort of the scenario, the question that John Walsh put at the very beginning, because this session's aimed at fleet drivers. What about 80% of the other drivers? You're right. I think both questions sort of tie in. Not doing that circle check before you leave a parking space, yes. I think educating drivers, whether they're driving a vehicle, somebody else's vehicle for work, or their own vehicle for work, is the way they drive it. If something happens, it hits them in their own pocket. And as quite straightforward as that seems, I think a lot of people who drive company vehicles and then get into their own vehicle at the end of the day don't see the correlation. So somebody, yes, and I apologise, John, going back to a fleet driver, but if a driver's driving a van or a lorry or a bus or a coach or a taxi for somebody else, has a collision in that vehicle or an incident in that vehicle, they should report it to their own private insurers as well. And this is a very unknown, a big unknown fact for a lot of drivers who drive company vehicles and fleet vehicles. Once they realise they have to report it to their own insurer, their perception of driving a company vehicle changes, because they then realise what happens in the company vehicle will also affect their own private insurance. People believe that because the incidents may happen on a company insurance, it doesn't have to go across, and it does. Then you need to advise drivers to check their policy to see when they need to report work incidents to their own private insurance company as well.
Okay, thanks very much. It looks like that's almost all the questions that we've had in for today. This is bringing us to about 2:45, so it seems we have enough time to end as any, so I'll do a quick wrap up. A huge thanks again to Andrew for joining us today for the Q&A and for delivering his presentation, and to Iain, who sadly couldn't make it today for the live section of today's webinar. But we hope you found all the content today informative and engaging. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, the recording of this will be placed on the Global Fleet Champions website in the coming days, so you can access this again. It'll also be on the Break YouTube channel. We hope you've enjoyed the webinar. If you want to continue the conversations that we've had today, we can do so on our Global Fleet Champions LinkedIn page, and you can view our upcoming program events at globalfleetchampions.org. Our next webinar will be broadcast on May 24th. Thank you again for all attending today. We hope you can join us again very soon.